The wind clawed at the cabin walls as if the night itself wanted inside. Snow rattled against the shutters, a steady hiss like voices whispering in the dark. Lila sat close to the fire, shawl pulled around her shoulders, watching the flames gnaw at the last of her cut logs. She had been rationing the wood, and still the storm showed no sign of easing. Loneliness had grown familiar to her, but nights like this made it a living presence, something that pressed against her skin more than the cold did. The silence between the crackle of fire felt like judgment. Her hand lingered at the window frame. She knew what the townsfolk said, that she had no business living alone, that a woman of her age ought to have remarried or gone to kin. Some called her stubborn, others whispered harsher things. She had stopped going to church after the looks became too heavy to carry. Out here in the storm, there was no one to look but herself, and even that reflection had grown wearisome. The storm deepened, the wind's voice pitching higher, almost like laughter. Lila stirred the fire, and in that moment, the knock came. It was not timid. A heavy, deliberate thud that made the latch tremble. She froze, heart stumbling in her chest. Few rode in weather like this. Fewer still would come to her door. For a breath she considered ignoring it, but the knock came again firmer. She lifted the rifle from above the hearth, hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of decision. With one motion she drew back the latch. The door shuddered open, and the storm lunged inside, snow swirling, bitter air slapping her face. Two figures stood in the white blur. One was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair clinging wet to his brow, snow crusting the folds of his coat. Beside him leaned an old woman, her white hair trailing out beneath a kerchief, her body bent as if each breath were labor. The man's eyes, deep-set and steady, met Lila's. He did not beg. He simply said, "One night. Shelter." His voice was low, rough as stone. Lila's first thought was danger. An Apache, towering before her, a storm raging at his back. Every tale she had heard in town rose up, painted in suspicion and fear. Yet beside him, the old woman shivered, lips pale, her hands clutching his arm as though the wind might sweep her away. Lila's rifle felt suddenly foolish. The man stepped forward just enough for the old woman to be seen clearly in the glow of firelight. Lila caught the dim glimmer of exhaustion in her eyes, the fragile persistence that reminded her of her own mother's last winter. Something inside her yielded. "You can come in," she whispered, though her voice was tighter than she wished. "For the night only." The man inclined his head, a gesture stripped of pride, and guided his mother inside. The storm followed them in a moment longer before Lila forced the door shut again. Snow swirled across the floorboards. She tightened the shawl around her shoulders, watching as the man helped his mother to a chair near the hearth. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls had drawn closer. The man removed his heavy coat, revealing scars etched across his forearms, the kind earned not from idle labor, but from a life lived near danger. Lila's breath caught, and she shifted her stance, the rifle still near her hand. "My name is Nawel," he said simply, settling the coat across his mother's shoulders. "This is Martha." The old woman lifted her gaze, her voice a whisper nearly lost to the crackling fire. "Thank you, dear." Lila nodded, unsure if words would betray her unease. She studied Nawel's hands as he arranged more wood at the fire, large, rough, but careful as he eased the flame back to life. He moved without asking, as though his presence had already been judged and found unwelcome, so he sought to prove worth in silence. Lila wanted to protest. This was her home, her fire, her small hold against the endless white, but she found herself watching instead. Each motion was steady, unhurried. He did not glance at her for approval. When Martha's shivers eased, Lila found her voice again. "The storm may last days. I have little food." Nawel's eyes flicked to hers, dark and unreadable, before he replied. "We take only what you allow. Tomorrow, if the storm breaks, I'll cut wood. Hunt." The words surprised her, so easily offered as if he knew her fears. She gave no answer, only turned back to the kettle hanging over the fire. Her hands, though, no longer shook as they had when she held the rifle. The night stretched on, each gust of wind striking the cabin like a thrown stone. The fire glowed steady, 3 figures gathered in its circle of warmth. Lila listened to Martha's slow breathing, to the near silence of Nawel's watchfulness. It felt strange, after years of solitude, to hear other rhythms of life within these walls. Strange, but not entirely unwelcome. She thought of the town then, their eyes, their gossip. If they knew she had opened her door to an Apache man and his mother, they would brand her reckless, foolish, or worse. Already her name carried weight enough. She told herself this night would be forgotten when the storm passed. Yet some quiet voice inside her knew that once a door was opened in such weather, it was not so easily shut again. Near midnight, Lila rose to check the shutters. Through a narrow crack she saw only the thick whirl of snow. Yet in that shifting white she imagined shapes, lanterns, watchers. She pressed the shutter closed quickly, telling herself it was only her mind playing tricks. But the unease lingered, curling close as the storm. When she turned back, Nawel's eyes were on her. Not sharp, not demanding, but steady, as though he had read something in her fear. He gave no words. Only lifted another log, set it to flame, and sat back again, silent sentinel in her cabin. Lila returned to her chair, her shawl tight, listening to the storm's relentless breath against the walls. The presence of these strangers had shifted something in her night, in her solitude, perhaps in her very standing with the world outside. For the first time in years, she was not alone. And for the first time, she wondered if the world beyond her cabin had already taken notice. Morning came like a dim gray hush, the storm still thick enough to blur the world into shifting white. Lila woke stiff in her chair, the shawl wrapped around her like armor. For a moment she forgot the strangers who had entered her cabin, but then she caught sight of them in the softened light. Martha asleep near the fire, her chest rising shallow but steady, and Nawel at the window, his broad frame shadowing the frost-glazed glass. He hadn't slept. He stood like a sentinel carved out of patience, his presence filling the small room without effort. Lila rose quietly, her steps careful on the boards. The kettle had gone cold. She busied herself with the fire, telling herself it was to avoid his eyes. Yet she felt them, steady and watchful, as if he measured not just her movements but the measure of her fear. When she finally met his gaze, he nodded once, neither smile nor frown, simply an acknowledgement that morning had come and they were still alive inside her walls. "You shouldn't waste your strength keeping watch," she murmured, surprised at how her voice sounded, gentler than she intended. Nawel answered with silence. Then, as though her words needed no answer, he pulled on his coat and lifted the axe from beside the door. Lila stiffened. "Where are you going?" "Wood," he said. One word, rough and final. She wanted to protest. The storm still tore at the world, and no one had asked him to touch her axe. But the thought of dwindling firewood, of nights with nothing but frost for company, knotted her stomach. She said nothing as he opened the door and stepped into the white roar. The cabin shook with the sudden gust, then quieted when he shut it behind him. Martha stirred at the noise, her eyes blinking open, pale blue under a crown of white hair. "Is he gone?" she whispered, her voice papery. "To the woodpile," Lila said. She poured what little cornmeal she had into a pot, stretching it with water. The old woman's gaze followed her, tired but kind. "You've lived here long?" Martha asked. Lila hesitated. Few ever asked without judgment writing their words. 3 years, she said finally. "Since my husband died." The old woman's eyes softened. "Alone?" The word was not question, but truth spoken aloud. Lila nodded, though the shame of it tightened her chest. Martha reached out a thin hand, resting it briefly on Lila's wrist. "Lonely ground can still grow good roots." Lila swallowed hard, caught off guard by the quiet grace in that voice. She turned back to the pot, unwilling to let her face show more than she meant. When Nawel returned, snow crusted his shoulders, beard rimmed white. He carried an armload of wood, more than she thought any man could wrest from the storm. He stacked it neatly by the hearth, then said nothing, his chest heaving once before settling into stillness again. Lila noticed the raw red at his knuckles, the frost clinging to his lashes. For a moment, she almost thanked him. Instead, she ladled thin porridge into 3 bowls. They ate without speech, the The sound of spoons the only conversation. Lila kept her eyes on the steam rising from the pot, but she felt something shift, as if the act of sharing food had bound them in a way words never could. The day dragged long with the storm's persistence. Nawel set himself to mending small things. The latch that had loosened on the door, the chair leg that had wobbled for months. He worked in silence, each motion deliberate, as though repaying debt not asked but understood. Lila wanted to tell him to leave her things be, but watching his hands steady what she had grown used to enduring in brokenness stilled her tongue. By afternoon, hoofbeats thudded faint through the storm. Lila's blood ran cold. Few would ride out in such weather unless duty or suspicion pushed them. A sharp rap came at the door. Nawel's head lifted, eyes narrowing. Lila moved first, her body tense. When she opened the door, a gust shoved snow inside along with a man's voice. "Lila." Deputy Harlan stood there, his hat rimed with frost, his mustache stiff with ice. He peered past her shoulder, suspicion narrowing his gaze. "Heard tell there were tracks leading to your place. Apache tracks." His eyes slid to the woodpile, to the faint shape of Nawel standing inside. "You've taken them in." Lila's throat tightened. Harlan had always carried a particular sharpness toward her, as if her independence was an affront to his order. "They were caught in the storm," she said, forcing calm. The old woman would have frozen. "Storm or no storm, folks won't look kindly on this," Harlan said. His words were clipped, meant to sting. A widow alone, already the subject of talk, and now this. His glance cut at Nawel. "You'll find your name dragged lower than it already is." Shame flared hot in Lila's chest. She wanted to slam the door to end his cutting voice, but his words struck at her deepest fear. That every act of kindness she gave would be twisted into evidence of disgrace. Nawel stepped forward then, not with menace but with the quiet weight of presence. He stood tall, silent, his dark eyes locked on the deputy. Harlan's hand twitched near his holster, but he did not draw. The storm roared louder between them, as if the world itself strained against the tension. Lila forced herself to speak. "They'll stay until the storm breaks. That's all." Her voice shook, but she did not step aside. Harlan's jaw tightened. At last he tugged the brim of his hat down. "Have it your way. But don't say you weren't warned." He turned, mounting his horse, the storm swallowing him as quickly as it had delivered him. When the door closed, Lila leaned against it, her breath shallow. Shame burned in her, but beneath it flickered something else, a fragile thread of defiance. She glanced at Nawel. He had not moved, his face unreadable, but his presence felt like a wall between her and the cold judgment outside. That evening, as the fire crackled and Martha hummed some low, wandering tune, Lila sat with her sewing. Nawel carved quietly at a scrap of wood, his broad hands surprisingly gentle. Each of them carried silence differently, Martha with soft resignation, Lila with guarded restraint, Nawel with something steadier, like a river beneath ice. The hours stretched, the storm refusing to break. Lila's needle faltered as her thoughts circled Harlan's words. She imagined Tess Doolan's sharp tongue carrying gossip through town, imagined neighbors shaking their heads, muttering her name with pity or scorn. Yet when she looked up, her eyes caught Nawel's for the briefest moment. In them she did not see judgment, only watchfulness, as if he recognized the weight she bore without asking her to name it. Her chest tightened with something unfamiliar, both fear and strange comfort. She bent back to her stitching, though the thread trembled between her fingers. Outside, the wind howled, a beast with endless breath. Inside, 3 figures sat in fragile company, bound by firelight and the necessity of survival. Lila could not yet name what had shifted in her home, only that the storm was no longer her only burden. And when she glanced at the shutter before retiring, she swore she saw a faint lantern flicker in the distance, swallowed quickly by the snow, as though unseen eyes still lingered at the edge of her solitude. The storm did not relent. For 3 days the world beyond Lila's cabin was nothing but white fury, a muffled void where distance ceased to matter. Inside, time stretched slow and taut, each hour measured by the rhythm of the fire and the steady presence of those she had allowed in. What had begun as intrusion now shaped itself into uneasy company, a fragile braid of necessity and silence. Lila found herself watching more than speaking. Martha dozed in her chair, her breaths shallow yet persistent, her hands folded like bird wings over her lap. Nawel moved through the small space with quiet purpose, mending tools, setting snares, arranging the wood he brought in from the storm. Each action spoke more than words might have, and Lila, though wary, began to read his language of gestures. On the third morning, the roof groaned under heavy snow. Lila reached instinctively for her ladder, but Nawel's hand was already on it. He looked at her with a brief shake of his head, then climbed into the storm without a word. Lila stood at the window, shawl pulled tight, and watched his figure blur into the blizzard. He moved with the weight of a man who had fought storms before, deliberate and unhurried. She caught her breath at the way he bent into the wind, each step carving defiance into the white. When he returned, his shoulders glistening with ice, she felt a strange warmth cut through her unease. He stamped the snow from his boots and went straight to the fire, thawing his hands. Lila busied herself with the kettle, unwilling to meet his eyes. Yet when she set the steaming tin before him, her fingers brushed his. Heat flared in her chest, sharper than the fire's glow. That evening, Martha stirred from her doze and asked Lila about her stitching. Lila hesitated, but brought out the small quilt she had been piecing together from scraps of worn dresses. Martha touched the seams with trembling fingers. "Steady hands," she murmured. "Patience is its own strength." Lila felt a lump rise in her throat. No one had spoken of her work with anything but dismissal before. Later, as night pressed close, Lila found herself speaking aloud the grief she usually swallowed. She told of her husband's fever, of burying him in frozen earth, while the town looked on with more curiosity than kindness. She spoke of the years after, how people turned their backs when she passed, how her offers of work were met with suspicion, how solitude had hardened into armor she could no longer take off. She hadn't meant to speak so much, yet the words tumbled out, fragile and bitter. When she stopped, ashamed of her spilling, she expected silence. Instead, Nawel, from his chair near the fire, said in a low voice, "The earth knows grief too. It swallows what we love and does not return it. But it remembers." The simplicity of it pierced her. She lifted her eyes and met his. For a moment, the storm outside was not as loud as the stillness between them. He looked away first, resuming the quiet carving of a piece of wood in his hands, but something had shifted. Lila felt it settle in her chest like a coal that might yet grow into flame. On the fourth night, she woke to a sound different from the wind. Through a narrow crack in the shutter, she saw faint glimmers moving on the ridge. Lanterns. Too many to be chance travelers. Her stomach clenched. Town eyes had not only noticed, they lingered. She let the shutter fall and sat in the dark, the image of those flickers burned behind her eyes. The next morning, she moved through her chores distracted, her ears straining for hoofbeats. Nawel caught her glance toward the shutters, and seemed to understand without words. He took up the axe and went outside again, the storm easing just enough to allow him distance. His figure dwindled toward the treeline, steady as always, but Lila could not shake the fear that someone beyond the storm was watching his every step. By noon, the storm softened to flurries. Lila ventured outside to fetch water. The air was knife-sharp, but the silence after days of blizzard felt almost holy. She glanced toward the ridge and saw only blank snow, no lanterns. Yet the memory of them clung like smoke. Inside, she found Nawel repairing her roof beam, the scarred muscles of his forearms taut beneath his shirt. Each strike of the mallet echoed with assurance. Lila stood in the doorway, caught between fear of gossip and the quiet awe of watching something broken made whole. She wanted to tell him he need not do it, but the words died. Perhaps she needed someone to mend what she could not. That night, she found herself humming while she stitched, a tune her mother had once sung. Martha smiled faintly in her sleep, as though remembering some old melody of her own. Nawel sat across the room, carving still, his eyes lifting now and then to Lila, as if her voice had drawn a line between them that neither dared cross yet could not ignore. The fire burned bright, casting shadows that made the cabin feel larger than it was. Lila realized she had not felt this much warmth, not from flame alone in years. She lifted her eyes once more and caught Nawel watching her. For the first time he smiled. A small, restrained thing but real. Her breath caught, and she returned it, hesitant yet unshaken. Something passed between them then, not words, not promises, but the recognition of another soul carrying weight through the snow. But just as the warmth settled, the sound returned. Hoofbeats, muffled but certain, circling closer than before. Lila stiffened, her needle slipping from her fingers. Nawel rose, silent, every line of his body taut. Martha stirred, whispering his name like a prayer. The fire snapped, loud in the sudden stillness. Lila moved to the window, heart pounding, and pushed the shutter aside. There, through drifting snow, lanterns again, nearer this time, their glow too deliberate to mistake for stars. A cluster of riders, silent in the white, waiting. She let the shutter fall, breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. The weight of survival had carried them this far, bound by storm and fire. But now, beyond the walls, judgment had gathered with purpose. And Lila knew the storm inside her life was only just beginning. The wind howled like a wounded beast, carrying with it the faint echoes of men waiting beyond the ridge. Lila sat rigid in her chair, needle and thread abandoned in her lap. The lantern light outside had burned itself into her mind, each flicker a reminder that judgment was near. She tried to steady her breath, but her chest felt bound by ropes of fear. Across the room, Nawel stood at the window, broad frame still as stone, his gaze fastened to the shifting white. He had not spoken since she let the shutter fall, yet his silence said enough. He, too, knew what gathered beyond the storm. Martha stirred in her chair, her fragile voice breaking the weight. "They'll come." Her words trembled, not from doubt but from weary certainty. Lila turned toward her, the old woman's pale face lit by firelight, eyes glimmering with the wisdom of years that had known both cruelty and grace. "Storm or no storm," Martha whispered, "they will not let it rest." Lila swallowed hard, her palms slick. She had lived long under the town's whispers, but this was different. This was not gossip drifting on wind. It was men with lanterns, rope, and rifles. She imagined Tess Doolan's sharp voice fanning flames at the hearth of every household, painting Lila as a fallen woman, reckless enough to shelter a savage. Shame rose hot in her, but beneath it flickered something harder, a thin wire of defiance she had not felt in years. Nawel stepped back from the window. He moved to the hearth, adding wood to the fire with measured calm. The flames leapt higher, throwing his shadow across the room. Tall, unyielding, a shape that seemed carved from the storm itself. Lila's eyes followed him, drawn to the way his presence steadied her even as fear churned in her gut. She realized then that silence could be its own vow, that his wordless strength was not absence but choice. Hours dragged, each gust of wind rattling the cabin like a warning. Near dawn, the hoofbeats came, faint but steady. Lila rose, her legs weak beneath her. She reached for the door latch, but Nawel's hand stopped hers. He shook his head once, then moved past her. For a moment she thought he meant to face them alone, but instead he set the bar firm against the door, and returned to the fire. His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. "Not yet," he said, the first words he had spoken in hours. The knock came soon after, hard, demanding, a sound that made Martha flinch. Lila's heart hammered. "Lila Bellamy." The voice was Deputy Harlan's, sharp as an axe. "Open this door. The town won't have you harboring him." Lila felt every nerve in her body seize. She looked at Nawel, at Martha, at the fire that seemed the only safe thing left in the world. She had lived years bending beneath judgment, swallowing her pride until it tasted like ash. Yet something in her rebelled now. Perhaps it was the sight of Martha's frail figure, or Nawel's quiet watch, or the endless cold pressing against her walls. Slowly, she lifted her chin. She stepped to the door, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "This is my home," she said. "What happens under my roof is my choice." Outside, Harlan's laugh was short, bitter. "Your choice will ruin you. Folks already doubt your virtue, and now you give them proof. You think kindness will shield you? He'll bring nothing but ruin." Lila's hands shook against the doorframe, but she did not retreat. "If it ruins me to show mercy, then so be it." Her voice cracked, but the words stood. She had never spoken back to Harlan before. In the silence that followed, she felt something uncoil inside her chest. Fear loosening its grip, replaced by a fragile dignity that burned warmer than the fire. There was a murmur outside, men's voices low, uncertain. The storm gusted, swallowing words, leaving only fragments. Harlan shouted again, but his voice no longer struck as sharp. At last, the hoofbeats retreated, the lanterns vanishing into the gray dawn. Lila slumped against the wall, her whole body trembling, breath ragged. Nawel moved to her side, not touching, only standing close enough that she felt the heat of him. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his face. Not just watchfulness, but recognition, as if he had witnessed her claim herself again. A softness passed between them, fleeting yet undeniable. Martha's voice, faint but steady, filled the silence. Storms don't just break houses. They test what's inside them. The day that followed was strangely quiet. Lila moved through her tasks with trembling hands, but each motion carried a new weight. When she fetched water from the half-frozen barrel, Nawel followed, his steps silent but protective. When she stumbled in the snow, he offered his arm, and though she hesitated, she took it. Inside, when Martha tired, Lila tucked blankets around her with a tenderness that felt less like obligation, and more like kinship. That night, the fire blazed high. Lila sat stitching beneath its glow, her needle steady, her mind clearer than it had been in years. Across from her, Nawel carved by the light, his shadow cast tall against the wall. Once, their eyes met, and this time neither looked away. A small smile touched Lila's lips, unbidden but real. Nawel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Less hardness, more quiet acknowledgement. The bond was not spoken, but it was there, forged in fire and storm. As midnight neared, the wind eased, the blizzard softening into drifting snow. Lila rose to fasten the shutter and caught her breath. Across the white, at the far ridge, lanterns glowed again. Closer, brighter, more deliberate. Riders had not gone far. They had only waited. Her hand froze on the latch as a chill deeper than winter spread through her. The bond forged within her walls would not be enough to keep the world outside at bay. Judgment had not retreated. It was gathering for something more. The lanterns across the ridge did not vanish with dawn. Lila saw them through the shutters, steady points of gold against the white, like watchful eyes refusing to blink. Fear coiled low in her stomach, yet beneath it burned something else, an ember of defiance that refused to dim. She knew what they intended. This was no idle gathering of curious men. It was judgment forming shape, a verdict delivered on horseback. For years she had borne their whispers. Now they meant to make her shame flesh and rope. Nawel stood by the window, his body a silhouette against the pale light. His hand rested on the axe handle, though his stance was not of a man eager for fight, but one prepared for what could not be avoided. Martha stirred from her blanket, her frail voice carrying across the room. They will come at you hard. And they will not stop until one of you yields. Lila met the old woman's gaze and saw no fear there, only weary knowledge. When the hoofbeats finally thundered down from the ridge, Lila's breath caught. She gripped the doorframe as shadows emerged through the snow. A dozen riders at least, rifles glinting, rope coiled at a saddle horn. At their front sat Deputy Harlan, his jaw set hard, his eyes cold with purpose. He raised a hand, and the men halted, their horses stamping impatiently in the frost. "Lila Bellamy," he called, voice cutting through the storm. "Step aside. That Apache does not belong here. Nor his kin. You shame yourself and this town by harboring them." Lila's chest tightened. For years she had bent under his tone, shrinking smaller with each word he spoke. But not now. She pushed the door wide, the wind rushing in, and stepped onto the threshold. Snow whipped her skirts, stung her face, but she stood tall. "This is my home," she said, her voice louder than she thought possible. "And under my roof they stay." A murmur rippled through the riders, some shifting uneasily in their saddles. Harlan's glare sharpened. "You'll regret this pride. Mercy for him will damn you." Lila trembled, but she did not waver. "It isn't mercy," she answered. It's dignity. Something you've forgotten. Behind her, Nawel moved into the doorway. His presence loomed, a silent force beside her, the storm wreathing his shoulders in white. He did not speak, but the weight of him made the air itself seem to tighten. Lila felt it, his steadiness flowing into her, holding her upright when her legs threatened to buckle. Harlan's hand dropped near his holster. You think he'll protect you? He'll bring ruin. Before Lila could reply, Martha's voice rose, frail yet piercing. She had pushed herself upright, leaning heavily on her cane, her white hair gleaming against the firelight. Ruin, she said, her tone trembling but fierce. I've seen ruin, deputy. I've buried children, crossed deserts, and known hunger that gnawed bone. And I tell you this, what ruins a soul isn't sheltering the stranger. It's cruelty. It's cowardice dressed as law. The words cut sharper than any blade. The men shifted again, no longer so sure. Harlan's face reddened, fury warring with doubt. You dare shame me, old woman? Martha lifted her chin, frail yet unyielding. I speak truth, and if truth shames you, that is your burden. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Snow swirled around them, the world suspended between violence and retreat. Then Harlan spat into the frost and jerked his reins. You'll find no peace among us, Lila. You've chosen your ruin. He wheeled his horse, the others following, their lanterns vanishing into the storm one by one. Silence fell heavy after their departure, broken only by the wind. Lila's shoulders sagged, her breath shuddering free. She felt Nawel's gaze on her, and when she turned, she found him closer than before, his eyes no longer unreadable. They carried something softer, deeper, a recognition that went beyond gratitude. Inside, she helped Martha back to her chair, tucking the blankets firm. The old woman grasped her hand, her skin papery but strong. You held your ground, Martha whispered. That's what makes a home, not walls but courage. Lila swallowed hard, her throat tight. She turned toward Nawel, who stood near the hearth, his hands resting lightly at his sides. For the first time, words rose in her that were not bound in fear. You belong here, she said quietly, though her voice trembled. He did not answer with speech. Instead he stepped forward, placed a piece of wood gently onto the fire, and stood beside her. The gesture, small as it was, felt larger than any vow. Lila felt warmth spread through her chest, steadier than flame, stronger than the storm. As night deepened, the blizzard eased at last. Through the shutter crack, Lila saw the stars break open, glittering against black sky. The storm had passed, but its mark lingered, on the drifts piled high, on the silence left behind and within her. She had stood against shame, not for herself alone, but for the strangers who were no longer strangers. Something had been forged here, quiet and unspoken, yet unbreakable. And when the last embers settled into the hearth, she knew the storm outside had only been a herald. The true reckoning lay ahead, in the eyes of a town unwilling to forget. But for now, in the hush of snow and fire, Lila felt steadied by the bond she had chosen.